It's my pleasure to introduce Harriet Senie. She is the co-organizer of today's Redefining Memorials, the Conflation of Heroes and Victims. Harriet is the director of museum studies and a professor of art history at the City College in New York and CUNY's Graduate Center. She is the co-founder and co-director of the College Art Association affiliate organization, Public Art Dialogue, and co-editor of its journal. Ms. Senie is the author of The Tilted Art Controversy, Dangerous Precedent, and Contemporary Public Sculpture, Tradition, Transformation, and Controversy. She is the co-editor with fellow panelist Sally Webster of Critical Issues in Public Art. She is currently completing a book entitled Memorials to Shattered Myths, Vietnam to 9/11, excuse me. Please welcome Harriet.
How's that? Can you hear me okay? Great, thank you. Thanks for the introduction. Thanks to the conference organizers. It's great to be here. Thanks to you for being here early on a Saturday morning. Thanks to my panelists, and especially Craig, who has taken care of all our tech issues and said to me 2 seconds earlier when there were some other tech issues, don't worry about a thing. And I asked him to text me that message every morning. It will radically improve my life. So, as you've just heard, I'm co-editor of Public Art Dialogue, and all our speakers are on the journal's editorial board. And I'm completely embarrassed to say we have no copies of the journal here. We're not nearly so well organized as Jack Becker, and we have Rutledge or Routledge to speak to about that. Anyway, we've decided to be very brief on our intros. My co-chair, Craig Freeman, is professor of new media at Emerson College. Charlotte Cohen is fine arts officer with the U.S. General Services Administration, GSA, and our commentator, Sally Webster, is professor Emerita at Lehman College and the CUNY Graduate Center, and all our credentials are available in the conference booklet, so we thought we'd save the time for questions. This panel was prompted by a conversation that I had with Craig a while ago about school shootings, when it quickly became apparent that we were working on very similar issues in obviously very different media. And we realized that this was a kind of cross-disciplinary dialogue that we don't have very often. So today, in addition to 2 art historians, Sally and myself, we have a public art advisor, Charlotte, and an artist, Craig. So, are extrapolated from my forthcoming book, Memorials to Shattered Myths, Vietnam to 9/11. The Vietnam War, the Oklahoma City bombing, the Columbine High School shootings, and the 9/11 attacks all challenged myths of national identity. Vietnam was a war the United States didn't win on the ground, in Asia, or politically at home. Oklahoma City revealed domestic terrorism in the heartland. Columbine debunked legends of high school as an idyllic time. And 9/11 demonstrated, among other things, United States' vulnerability to international terrorism. Memorials to these critical events focused overwhelmingly on individuals lost, thus conflating the function of cemeteries, where deaths are singular and grieving is personal, with the task of memorials, to remember and mourn actual and symbolic communal losses. The book traces the evolution of the consequences of this new hybrid paradigm and its accompanying narratives. But what I'd like to focus on here are the implications of the valorization of victims, or as I have come to think of it in my more private moments, the valorization of victims and my discontents. Kirk Savage, in Monument Wars, called the Vietnam Veterans Memorial the nation's first true victim monument and its first therapeutic memorial. And these are critical aspects. One, defining a new subject for memorials, and the second, a new role. The site of the Vietnam Veterans Memorial between the Lincoln Memorial and the Washington Monument on the National Mall defines it as central to United States unity and identity, even though the undeclared war it commemorates prompted a political crisis that divided the country into antagonistic factions. Thus, one might say that there is an element of denial implicit in the site, that the site is an attempt to contain the war between acceptable, even revered national parameters. And although the memorial itself is considered successful being variously defined, it has hardly contained the subject it was not allowed to address. Jan Scruggs, the veteran who initiated the commission, wanted to honor the sacrifice of those who fought by listing their names. He wanted to separate the soldiers from the war. Maya Lin's winning design was perceived from the start as a giant tombstone. People responded immediately as if the bodies were buried there, leaving tributes at the base of the wall, much as they might at a local burial ground, thus conflating the functions of a memorial with that of a cemetery. Let me go back a little bit here. Lin's memorial became a prototype, particularly in the listing of the names of the dead, the use of a reflective surface, the inclusion or proximity of a water feature, and the creation of a memorial complex, not just the two sculptural additions to Maya Lin's, but also the creation of the not yet completed education center across the street, altogether offering multiple interpretations rather than a single structure with perhaps more limited meanings. These elements are evident, or in the case of Columbine, were planned for all the memorials discussed here. In all, the focus on the victims is paramount, and the relics pertaining to them are stored and some exhibited in an adjacent or nearby structure. Let me just go here. The cemetery rituals that are commonplace at the Vietnam Veterans Memorial, I'm sorry about this last minute change in my plans. The cemetery rituals that are commonplace at the Vietnam Veterans Memorial, and this image is just a composite of a few of the things that have been left at its base, are also a familiar widespread response to sudden death in public spaces, whether the result of a car accident, drive-by shooting, or intentional act of terrorism. Although this practice is sadly familiar, we have yet to settle on a term to define it. I think most commonly it's called spontaneous memorials. You all know what I mean, right? It seems to me that the most salient characteristic of this contemporary populist ritual, however, is its immediacy, answering the need to do something at once in the face of terrible shock and tragedy. So I refer to the clusters of objects that people bring to the site of sudden, unexpected public death as immediate memorials. And this practice stems from a very old and apparently nearly universal tradition of roadside memorials. Those commemorating traffic accidents include an implicit element of protest, often leading to campaigns for better signage, a stoplight, etc., as do those dedicated to drive-by shootings, usually prompting a call to end the violence and some kind of gun control. There is certainly an element of protest in the immediate memorials to the larger scale killings discussed here. That practice was made public at the Vietnam Veterans Memorial. Its continuity was built into the Oklahoma City Memorial by including a portion of what had been called the memory fence. People still leave things there. These objects are archived in the adjacent museum, where a selection is also on display. At Columbine, there's no memorial museum. They're stored in the Littleton Historical Society, where only some are occasionally exhibited. And some 9/11 immediate memorials will be included in the National September 11th Memorial Museum, scheduled to open officially next month. I have not had a chance to see it yet, so these remarks are based on images that I have seen. Oklahoma City. The bombing of the Alfred A. Murrah Federal Building in Oklahoma City on April 19, 1995, prompted headlines proclaiming terrorism in the nation's heartland, a region presumed to be quintessentially safe. While the Vietnam War was debatable as a cause worth dying for, the bombing could not be seen as such. Its casualties were random victims, many children, who died at the hand of a young American Iraq War veteran disillusioned with his country and its values. Timothy McVeigh chose his target precisely because it represented the government. His attack on the 2-year anniversary of the FBI-led siege on the Branch Davidian compound at Waco, Texas, was both an act of revenge and protest. The 168 dead were going about their daily lives. This was true of the Columbine and 9/11 victims as well. And it raises questions of categories of victims. I'm just suggesting 3 here, that those who fight in wars, whether by choice or draft, are implicitly at risk, those who die as victims of genocide, wholesale deaths, and those who die during the course of their daily lives, including the civilian deaths defined as collateral damage during war. In any event, victims are at the center of the memorials I'm discussing here and their related institutions. The process for creating the Oklahoma City Memorial is significant. Its overriding emphasis on the role of victims' families emphasized the personal grieving element over the communal significance, or perhaps it just conflated the two. The 350-member Memorial Task Force, appointed by the mayor and chaired by a local attorney, convened in July of 1995, just a scant 2 months after the bombing. Their charge was, quote, to create a memorial that is appropriate, enduring, non-exclusionary, and, my emphasis, sensitive to the needs and feelings of those who were most directly affected by the bombing, end quote. The Oklahoma City Memorial was as intentionally therapeutic in the sense that Kirk Savage defined, not only in its purpose, but also in its process. The practice of commissioning memorials as a form of therapy is something I will return to, and also a problem I think that it would be useful to think about. On more than one occasion, with only slight variations, former President Bill Clinton stated, "Oklahoma City made us all Americans again." This encapsulated the way the Oklahoma City bombing and other crises for a time create a sense of community based on shared victimhood that then prompts a resurgence of triumphal narratives, in this case institutionalized in the adjacent museum. Edward Linenthal, who wrote The Unfinished Bombing, Oklahoma City in American Memory, had just finished his book, Preserving Memory, The Struggle to Create America's Holocaust Memorial Museum, a model, it turns out, for the museum in Oklahoma City. The Oklahoma City Memorial also suggests the influence of German Holocaust memorials. The architects, Hans and Tori Butzer, were living in Berlin at the time of the commission. Specifically, the central element, 168 sculptures of empty chairs, symbolic of the absent dead, evoke Carl Biedermann's recently unveiled Holocaust memorial, The Abandoned Room. Intended to suggest the disruptive effect of the Holocaust, this memorial consists of a bronze table and 2 empty chairs, one overturned, and the memorial is situated in the middle of the Koppenplatz, a quarter where Eastern European immigrants once lived and Jewish institutions coexisted with their Christian counterparts. The nighttime illumination of the chairs in Oklahoma City may have been inspired by another Berlin Holocaust memorial. Israeli sculptor Misha Ullman's library commemorating the famous book burning of May 1933. Situated underground on the Bebelplatz, surrounded by cultural institutions along the famous Unter den Linden Boulevard, it consists of a glass-covered subterranean room painted a stark, eerie white and lined with empty, floor-to-ceiling bookshelves. During the day, the cover is often fogged, rendering the memorial all but invisible. But at night, it is lit up, drawing people to the light emanating from below. And so, the very ground of Berlin, like the unconscious mind, seems to suppress trauma during the day, only to release it hauntingly transformed into the night. The light emitted by the bases of the chairs at Oklahoma City, let's see if we can, were we there already? Yeah. This light is much more reassuring. It emits a golden glow rather than a white glare. But although it is above ground, it seems to come from another or nether world. The rows of chairs, here we go. The rows of chairs in Oklahoma City prompted one landscape architect to think of Arlington National Cemetery, quote, where the identical nature of the markers unites the individuals, end quote. A woman whose mother died in the bombing objected to the chairs because, quote, they look like headstones in a cemetery. Emerita Sturkin, in Tourists of History, Memory, Kitsch, and Consumerism from Oklahoma City to Ground Zero, observed that the, quote, chairs provide a space where the dead are perceived to reside, end quote. And Paul Goldberger, in a New Yorker article, likened their appearance at night to, quote, a glowing field of votive candles, but, he concluded, they still resemble tombstones. From the start, the Butzers imagined that the chairs would provide, quote, a place for friends and family to leave tokens of their love, end quote. And this does indeed happen, especially on bombing anniversaries and holidays, appropriate holiday music, when people gather and leave things on or around them. This public response is comparable to the rituals that take place at the Vietnam Veterans Memorial. They create a space which I would like to suggest functions as a symbolic cemetery. The 10th anniversary of the bombing, which I intended, featured a series of events clearly intended to situate Oklahoma City in a historical and international community of victims. Its new status, evidenced by the presence of dignitaries and the media, was a direct result of the bombing. It was now linked not only to Columbine and 9/11, but well beyond. And it should be noted that the third element of the Oklahoma City complex is the Memorial Institute for the Prevention of Terrorism. Columbine. The Columbine High School shooting on April 20th, 1999 occurred just 4 years after the Oklahoma City bombing. The official memorial by DHM Design, however, was a strictly local enterprise, a modest structure near the school but invisible from it. Although Columbine was not the first or last school shooting in United States history, it's believed to be actually the 10th, it was the one that prompted the greatest shockwaves and media response. Eric Harris and Dylan Klebold, who killed 13 and themselves on the 110th birthday of Adolf Hitler, planned their rampage for at least a year and described it, quote, as a means to be a greater end, to terrorize the entire nation by attacking a symbol of American life, end quote. By this, of course, they meant high school in an affluent middle-class American city. Littleton responded by eradicating as much of the evidence of the crime and the criminals as possible. They deliberately omitted over and over again any reference to the shooters, and they rebuilt the library where the largest number of deaths occurred, placing a mural of trees in the atrium. The focus of the memorial was always intended to be on the victims and the community. The mission statement developed by the 20-member committee stated that the purpose of the memorial was, quote, to create a respectful place where family members, members of the community, and visitors could go, my emphasis, to gain an understanding of the innocent victims of Columbine. Further, to create a memorial with content and purpose 100% derived from members of the Columbine community and keeping with the scale, materials, and natural forms found in the Columbine area, to recognize and honor the deceased, the injured, the survivors, and community members. During the 8.5 years it took to raise the funds, Chapel Hill Mortuary and Cemetery served as the de facto memorial. 13 black granite crosses emphasized the spiritual narrative that was used to explain Columbine. As one frequent visitor observed, quote, "I think the people who were moved by this, they're not coming from a worldly position. There are so many people who now lead a more godly life," end quote. The key elements of the built memorial are the inner ring of remembrance and the outer ring of healing. The inner ring is divided into 13 waist-high sections, one for each of the victims, engraved with their names and a personal reflection provided by their families. Over half the statements invoke God. The outer ring is built into a hillside, somewhat reminiscent of the way the Vietnam Veterans Memorial is set into the ground. The step perimeter red brick wall is inset with plaques engraved with quotes from students, parents, first responders, and some statements made at the groundbreaking, notably Bill Clinton's comment, by now a kind of official spin on tragedies that create communities of victims, quote, "Columbine was a momentous event in the history of the country. Even in the midst of tragedy, we've seen the best there is to see about our nation and human nature," end quote. Here, too, many comments reflected religious preoccupations, but in a more secular and to me more frightening vein. One student observed, quote, "I don't think our school was any different than any other high school in America," end quote. There's no question that the killings at Columbine can be understood as an attack on the institution or way of life, much as the bombings of Oklahoma City or the 9/11 attacks. Unlike the other memorial sites, Ground Zero is still considered a cemetery and will certainly be one when actual unidentified remains are placed in the adjacent museums in a private chamber. Reflecting absence, the built memorial by Michael Harriet and landscape architect Peter Walker owes much to Maya Lin's Vietnam Veterans Memorial. Lin was, in fact, on the jury and a great champion of this design. With its focus on two voids, I think I have a more, no, I thought I had a more void. Let's do this one. With its focus on two voids sited in the footprints of the towers, surrounded by massive waterfalls, it brings to mind the loop of the falling buildings replayed endlessly in the days following the attacks and on 9/11 anniversaries. Accompanied by the sound of the rushing, continuously disappearing water, it deliberately recreated the experience of both sudden and ongoing loss. Before the opening, Harriet speculated that people would be drawn immediately to the voids, thus staring into the abyss. Like the museum at Oklahoma City and the planned Vietnam Veterans Memorial Education Center, the National September 11th Memorial Museum will feature a wall of faces of individuals who died and will include details of their lives. Arranged in a grid, they will create the effect of a high school yearbook, ironically conveying uniformity rather than the individuality that was their purpose. All the memorials discussed here focus on the victims rather than the events that caused their death, events that challenge myths of national identity. In all cases, victims' families, or in the case of the Vietnam Veterans Memorial, also surviving veterans, played a prominent role in their commission. Indeed, the commissioning process itself, as I've suggested, was intended as, and for many served as, a therapeutic measure. I would like to suggest that they and the memorial process in general would be better served if this group were charged with creating a temporary memorial addressing their immediate needs until such time as a permanent structure is completed. This privileged class of survivors, often considered heroes, appears to be unlike any other, an extension of the honored status of the victims celebrated in these memorials. Seen as an aggregate, the Vietnam Veterans Memorial and its Education Center, the Oklahoma City National Memorial and Museum, The Columbine Memorial and the National September 11th Memorial and Museum focused on absent bodies, invoking their presence. In this way, they not only camouflage history, but ironically define the United States as a nation of victims, exactly the concept they and their accompanying institutionalized triumphal narratives were apparently created to obscure. By way of concluding, I would like to remind you that the Latin monumentum derives from the verb moneo, to warn, and thus signifies something that serves to warn or remind with regard to conduct of future events. Thank you.
Good morning, I'm Charlotte Cohen. How is the sound? Good? Yeah? Okay. I'm very glad to be here, and I'd like to thank Harriet for inviting me to participate on this panel. It's not a subject that I typically present in talks, but it's been great to have the opportunity to consider who are the victims and heroes, and the lack of distinction between them in the context of 4 public art projects that deal with an historic figure, a local initiative that's spread worldwide, an artwork that addresses common social issues, and a commemoration to a private individual. Discovering Columbus is a project from 2012 by Tatsu Nishi, commissioned by the Public Art Fund, a nonprofit public art organization in New York City. This is Columbus Circle, named for Christopher Columbus. It's a traffic circle in Manhattan at the intersection where Broadway meets the southwest corner of Central Park. It was completed in 1905 as part of Frederick Law Olmsted's vision for Central Park, which included a grand circle at its Merchants Gate entrance. The monument at the center of Columbus Circle, created by Italian sculptor Gaetano Russo, was erected as part of New York's 1892 commemoration of the 400th anniversary of Columbus's arrival in the Americas. Constructed with funds raised by Il Progresso, a New York City-based Italian language newspaper, the monument consists of a marble statue of Columbus on top of a 70-foot granite column decorated with bronze reliefs of his ships, and the pedestal includes an angel holding a globe. For Nishi's artwork, the monument was completely scaffolded, and the process of accessing the project required effort. You had to get a time ticket, wait in line, and then climb a great many stairs up through the scaffold. The entrance was created to feel as though you were entering a high-rise luxury apartment or hotel room. When you entered the room, you found Columbus in the center, surrounded by the accoutrement of such a place, the enormous scale of the living room, the glorious views of the park and surrounding neighborhood that are unavailable to common people, plenty of comfortable furniture, and a huge TV screen that played continuously. So the whole idea of this important person in the form of a sculptor looking down on us from on high was challenged, since you could be there in the room with him for as long as you liked, and were allowed to, and you were allowed to stay for as long as you liked in his presence. This has remained an important monument for people of Italian origin, and many of them were insulted and outraged by Nishi's work because it challenged a tribute to their heritage, and it was perceived as disrespectful to an individual whom they considered deserving of great honor. This is interesting because while one could get close to the statue, Columbus's biography and the history he represents were not referenced as part of the project. The artist did not provide any background information or explanation that I could find. Nor, in fact, in knocking the hero off the pedestal by bringing people face to face with him, did Nishi acknowledge the important controversy that's been raised in society at large about memorializing Columbus because of the treatment of American Indians subsequent to his arrival. His so-called discovery of a place where people already lived led eventually to the destruction of American Indian people in what some considered genocide. Indeed, the person who was once considered a hero and who remains one in the opinion of many people has had his status reversed. He's become interpreted as a victimizer. By not acknowledging this history in any way, the memorial was neutralized as an object for pure enjoyment and whimsy. My role and responsibility as a teacher and participant in the field of public art was brought home to me last month when I gave a talk for an undergraduate class at Bard College about memorials. An Italian-American student commented that his family hated Nishi's project, and he became very upset, and in fact he had to leave class because, as I learned later, he agreed with what I said about the negative interpretations of Columbus's legacy. It made him realize that his father is extremely racist, a very shocking revelation for this young man. So this material really does strike people on a very personal level. And lest we think that these old figurative statues on horses or columns no longer hold any emotional meaning, it was made very clear to me that they certainly still do, and that Columbus's position in history as a hero will continue to be questioned. If Columbus represents the hero turned victimizer, I'll now turn to two examples of people taking agency over issues of importance to the general public and that impact all sectors of our society. In the case of ghost bikes, survivors have become empowered through their public actions. Ghost bikes are pop-up tributes to cyclists as well as pedestrians who have been killed by motor vehicles. Rather than accept victim status, groups and individuals are making meaning out of these tragedies and even making a movement. It's an international campaign that sprang up from a local initiative. As noted on the website, they, quote, they serve as reminders of the tragedy that took place and are quiet statements in support of cyclists' right to safe travel, end quote. The first ghost bikes were created right here in St. Louis in 2003. And I've read that over 600 ghost bikes have appeared in over 200 locations throughout the world. Typically, the memorials are anonymous. They consist of a bike painted white with fake flowers, and this is a large part of their power because it demonstrates that anyone could be struck down at any time. It stops us in our tracks on our regular routines or paths. I found very few examples of tributes to specific people. Occasionally, there's the name of an individual, and rarely a photograph appears. These memorials relate to Harriet's idea about people being killed in the course of their daily lives, but they don't heroize them. These are modest, inexpensive tributes that are replicated in very similar ways wherever they appear. Harriet also talked just now about immediate memorials as evidence of mourning in protest, and she noted to me that ghost bikes are a kind of, quote, formalized immediate memorial, end quote, an important approach to keep in mind in this discussion. In addition to acknowledging the dead, ghost bikes represent a new way of taking back the streets for everyone, not just cars. This is, I quote from the homepage of the New York City chapter, quote, we seek to cultivate a compassionate and supportive community for survivors and friends of those lost, and to initiate a change in culture that fosters mutual respect among all people who share the streets, end quote. This language is very mindful. It's not accusatory or hateful of the car or driver. It doesn't cast blame or seek retribution, and it's not bombastic, religious, patriotic, or militaristic, as is often the case in memorials to large groups of people who have died in tragic accidents. Not only are these memorials responsive, the site is the very place where the fatality occurred and they appear very soon after, but they are also activist in a larger way. The movement also supports memorial bike rides, blessings of the bikes, and rides in silence, all performative actions that take place with many participants, sometimes thousands. One of the most well-known is Critical Mass, a cycling event typically held on the last Friday of every month. Through a flash mob method, people gather at a set location and time and travel as a group through a city or town streets on bikes. The event originated in 1992 in San Francisco, and within 10 years was being held in over 300 cities around the world. Critical Mass has been described as a monthly political protest ride and characterized as being part of a social movement for cyclists to reclaim the streets. This movement stresses that anyone could be a victim and that we all become heroes through this group action for change. On this site stood is an ongoing project by artist Norm Magnuson that addresses all of us as the victims of society at large through slightly ironic statements about challenging contemporary issues. The designs of his signs mimic official state historic markers or memorial bronze plaques that don't garner much attention when passed along a road or bolted to the facade of a building. To date, he's shown these pieces in galleries and has put them in friends' backyards. There's one about the disappearance of mom and pop shops due to the increase of big box stores that's located outside the small grocery in Bearsville, New York. Norm's ultimate ambition is to site them the entire length of the country at rest stops along I-78, from Michigan to Texas, making them accessible to thousands of people. Almost anyone could be victimized by the social ills that the signs depict, be it low pay because of one's gender or health problems caused by the air we breathe. We're challenged to think about these conditions and to consider how we are complicit and responsible, and how we can be the heroes in these struggles through our contributions to society. I've talked about a public art installation at the monument to a former hero, a social movement, and an artist project that heroizes all of us. And now I'll turn to a project that challenges how memorials are decided and who gets to be represented as the victim. This is Mellon Park, which is owned by the city of Pittsburgh. It's a public property, a beautifully scaled space with a terrace within a walled garden and an expanse of lawn and trees. It sits in a quiet residential neighborhood and is a lovely and peaceful place. It was once part of the private estate of Richard Beatty Mellon, whose 60-room mansion was the largest house in Pittsburgh. The house was torn down in 1941, and the estate transitioned into a city park and fell into disrepair starting in the 1970s. Today, Mellon Park is home to the Pittsburgh Center for the Arts and the Phipps Garden Center. I tell you this history because it's interesting to note the circling back to private patronage for the recent restoration of the park, which was a cooperative project of the Pittsburgh Parks Conservancy, the City of Pittsburgh, the Office of Public Art, and the family of Annie Siemens. The Anne Catherine Siemens Memorial, designed by artist Janet Zweig, is a feature of the restoration of the park and was made because of this public-private partnership. Embedded in the lawn are 150 points of light representing the stars and planets over Pittsburgh when Annie Siemens was born. The effect is created by the softly glowing lights, which are surrounded by small granite discs inscribed with the information about each star. Annie was the daughter of the couple who funded the restoration of the park, and this is a poignant tribute to her. She died after being hit by a car at the age of 19. This is a place she loved, and I suspect in large part that's the reason the Siemens funded the restoration, although I don't know that definitively. Like the victims commemorated by the Ghost Bike memorials, Annie became a victim as she went about her daily life. While this is a subtle memorial, mainly discernible at night and fully integrated into the landscape, it raises questions about the process that allows the creation of such tributes to private citizens. Why is this person, who is not a public figure, honored here on a publicly owned site? The memorial is certainly not about traffic safety or the larger social issues of traffic fatalities like ghost bikes, and it's not a memorial shared with others who died in similar ways. And while I love this work, I find it elegant, perfectly fitting for the scale and aesthetic of the park, and balanced in terms of being an exquisitely light touch and enjoyable, whether or not you know the meaning behind it. When I learned that it's on public land, that it is in fact a public park, I had a hard time wrapping my head around the ethics of how this memorial came about. Perhaps it's because much of my work has been in the context of government funding, where there are strict rules about who gets honored. In my experience working for the City of New York, we were often approached with requests to create memorials to elected officials, celebrities, and private citizens. These requests, sometimes demands, were negotiated very delicately, but aside from people who are agreed to be heroes and had been dead for a long time, and Harriet Tubman and Frederick Douglass are examples, as far as I can remember, there weren't any memorials to random individuals granted permission. More typically, there are naming opportunities in someone's memory on a gate, a structure, a traffic triangle, or a public slice of green space. When I asked about this particular memorial, I was told, that's Pittsburgh for you, where there's a very fluid line between public and private partnerships and land use. And that's exactly what's made its downtown and many other neighborhoods come back so successfully from the post-industrial economic abyss. These issues of patronage aside, does Annie Siemens represent us all, just as ghost bikes and norm signs put us in the active position of thinking, that could be me, I could be the person struck down, or the person with asthma? And does she also stand for the hero in all of us? We can improve our environment, contribute to our society. We can have an impact, even at such a young age, on all of the people around us. These projects allow us to claim victim and hero status simultaneously. Thank you.
Good morning, and thank you, everyone. It's been a really inspiring and fascinating couple of days. Since 2002, Since 2002, I've worked on the corner of Tremont and Boylston Street, overlooking the historic Boston Common, the first public park in the United States. As I walk across the park every morning, I often contemplate the role that the town square plays in the shaping of political discourse and national identity formation. As a location of the public sphere, the town square is traditionally where we make our monuments to our heroes. Speaker's Corner is the only place in Singapore where citizens are allowed to practice free speech, although a government permit is required to do so. The project is Orators Rostrum's Propaganda Stands, a location-based augmented reality public art project designed for smartphones and other mobile devices. It was exhibited in Speaker's Corner in Singapore in the fall of 2013. Whereas the public square was once the quintessential place to air grievances, display solidarity, express differences, celebrate similarities, remember, mourn, and reinforce shared values of right and wrong, it is no longer the only anchor for that interaction in the public realm. That geography has been relocated to a novel terrain, one that encourages the exploration of mobile location-based public art. Moreover, the public sphere is now truly open, as artworks can be placed anywhere in the world without the prior permissions from curators, government, or private authorities, with profound implications for art in the public sphere and the discourse that surrounds it. In the early 1990s, we witnessed the migration of the public sphere from the physical realm, the town square and its print augmentation, to the virtual realm, the placelessness, the everywhere but nowhere of the internet. In effect, the global digital network has facilitated the emergence of a new virtual space which corresponds to the physical geography around us. The public sphere is now crashing back down to place in the form of place-based virtual and augmented reality without losing its distributed character or its connections to the vast resources of the worldwide digital network. Perhaps it is a question for the art historians of this panel if the conflation of heroes and victims can be traced back to the early 20th century European and Russian avant-garde. In 1925, Sergei Eisenstein sought to communicate complex political ideas to a largely illiterate population. In doing so, he invented montage, a new visual language for the emerging technology of his time, cinema. In his groundbreaking film, Battleship Potemkin, meaning is constructed by poetic juxtaposition of seemingly unrelated film shots, many filmed at different times in different places. Eisenstein made heroes of not of generals and czars, but of people being gunned down on the steppes of Odessa. Commissioned by the Los Angeles County Museum of Art, Orators, Rostrums, and Propaganda Stands is based on the work of Gustav Clusius, including his designs for screen, radio, orators, rostrums, and propaganda stands from 1922, which were never actually built. Clusius was a pioneering member of the Russian constructivist movement. Like his contemporary Eisenstein, he was attempting to harness the emerging technologies of the day, film, radio, sound amplification. He proposed creating structures for the public square to broadcast Bolshevik principles to the people, the heroes of the revolution. As Russian politics degenerated under the Stalin dictatorship in the 1920s and 30s, Clusius became under increasing pressure to devote his artwork to state propaganda. In addition to Los Angeles, this project was exhibited at Kunsthallen Nikolai in Copenhagen in 2012. And in the Triennale di Milano in Milan, Italy. The animations include frames from the Battleship Potemkin juxtaposed with images from recent political uprisings. Here we have Altair Square and the Pepper Spring at the University of California. Clusius's whereabouts, despite his loyal service to the Communist Party, Clusius was arrested in Moscow on January 17, 1938. His whereabouts remained a mystery until 1989, when it was discovered that he had been executed by Stalin just after his arrest. 25 years ago this year, in 1989, students from the Central Academy of the Fine Arts in Beijing erected a 10-meter tall plaster statue known as the Goddess of Democracy during the uprisings in Tiananmen Square, taunting government officials to tear it down, which of course they did. Tiananmen Squared is a two-part augmented reality public art project and memorial by the anonymous art collective Four Gentlemen, dedicated to human rights and democracy worldwide. Built for smartphone mobile devices, this project allows people to see virtual objects integrated into the physical location as if they existed in the real world. It includes a virtual replica of the Goddess of Democracy, built to full scale in the round, 3 dimensions, placed back in Tiananmen Square. And the other indelible image from the Tiananmen Square uprisings was, of course, Tank Man facing down a column of Type 62 tanks. And, oh, crying out loud, sorry. Just give me a moment. You can go ahead. And as we know, images do matter. Visible only through the viewfinder of a smartphone, both augmentations have been placed back in Beijing at the precise GPS coordinates where the original incidents took place. This is Tank Man on Qian Avenue, or its virtual representation. Essentially, all of the uprisings of the 20th century have centered in the public squares. However, this physical location is now augmented and supported by social media and the mobile network, the Twitter revolutions, as they're called. Manifest AR is an international artist collective working with emergent forms of augmented reality as interventionist public art. The group formed after the groundbreaking uninvited augmented reality intervention at the Museum of Modern Art in the fall of 2010. It is now the artist, not the curator, who decides which artworks can be placed where. We see this medium as a way of transforming public space and institutions by responding to and overlaying the configuration of located physical meaning. Utilizing this technology as art is a new proposition that explores all that we know and experience as a mixture of the real and the hyper-real. Art world power structures, nation states, the nature of art exhibitions and discourse are all called into question, even the border between art and life itself. We ask the question, who will assert dominion over the virtual space that surrounds us? Border Memorial Fronteras de los Muertos is an augmented reality public art project and memorial dedicated to the thousands of migrant workers who have died along the US-Mexico border in recent years, trying to cross the deserts of the Southwest in search of work and a better life. This project allows people to visualize the scope of the loss of life by marking each of the locations where human remains have been recovered along the border and surrounding desert. This image is from the border fence near Arizona's Lukeville border crossing. Based on a traditional form of wood carving from Oaxaca, the virtual augmentation objects consist of a life-size, three-dimensional geometric model of a skeleton effigy, or calaca, as they're known. Calacas are used in commemoration of lost loved ones during the Mexican Dias de los Muertos, or Day of the Dead festival. This image is from one of the many locations in Oregon Pipe Cactus National Monument. This visualization was created by importing the database, which I acquired from Arizona's medical examiner's office, into Google Earth. In that empire, the art of cartography attained such perfection that the map of a single province occupied the entirety of a city, and the map of the empire, the entirety of a province. In time, those unconscionable maps no longer satisfied, and the Cartographers Guild struck a map of the empire whose size was that of the empire, in which coincided point for point with it. The following generations, who were not so fond of the study of cartography as their forebears had been, saw that that vast map was useless, and without some pitilessness, it was that they delivered it to the inclemencies of sun and winter. In the deserts of the West, still today, there are tattered ruins of that map inhabited by animals and beggars. In all of the land, there is no other relic of the disciplines Jorge Luis Borges on the exactitude of science. Imagine now the entire mobile internet with its manifestations of place as a worldwide public square. Flotsam is floating wreckage of a ship or its cargo. Jetsam is part of a ship, its equipment or cargo that has been purposefully cast overboard or jettisoned to lighten the load during a time of distress, and that sinks or either is washed ashore. Flotsam and Jetsam was produced in association with Digital Arts Week in Singapore in May of 2013. Marking the contours of expected sea level rise 50 years from now, Flotsam and Jetsam is a clarion call for the denizens of the world to take seriously the science of climate change and other abuses to the global environment by envisioning the debris left by storm surge and other manifestations of the incoming tide. It anticipates the victimization of the Earth itself. And this, the project moved to Hong Kong in 2013. Hans Richter AR was a collaboration between myself and my colleague Will Pappenheimer. The project was part of the retrospective exhibition Hans Richter Encounters at the Los Angeles County Museum of Art in the summer of 2013. It was installed in a section of the exhibition that Timothy Benson, the curator, dedicated to the representation of the film Un Foto, or FIFO, exhibition that took place in Stuttgart in 1929, and for which Hans Richter served as film curator. Hans Richter AR reimagines this groundbreaking exhibition in response to the emergent technology of our time. Designed by Ella Zisky and his wife, Sophie, FIFO was intended to put into practice the ideas of expanded cinema that Richter and his contemporaries were experimenting with at the time. Richter and other avant-garde artists of Europe and Russia were committed not only to the idea that a new visual language needed to be invented, but that cinema should shed its reliance on the narrative forms of the past. They were trying to break with the use of the theater as an interface metaphor for film. Early film was most often made by setting up actors in front of a camera as if to make a play. The film was then displayed on a screen in front of an audience as if the screen were a stage. Many of the principles of the avant-garde relating to the need to invent a new visual language stuck, and in fact formed the basis of construction and meaning in contemporary cinema. Montage is so commonplace now that it mostly goes unnoticed, but in 1929 it was quite literally revolutionary. However, the notions of expanded cinema space, a space that envelops and immerses the audience, has gone largely unrealized, but will perhaps find its expression in virtual and augmented reality. I hope to extend the line of inquiry that Richter and others began in the early 20th century. The questions they raised in response to the emerging technology of their time are questions that will never be fully answered and must be continued to be asked in the 21st century. I'll diverge from the panel, and all of you will humor me, and ask you to think for a moment of the 21st century equivalent of the St. Louis Arch, not the sculptural form, but the symbolic gesture of a portal to a new reality. Metronext, with service to Zurich, will include the physical replica of a vintage New York City subway entrance placed in Grand Central Station on May 16th through the 22nd this year for those of you in New York. There will be a public, there the public will be transported to the virtual street scene in Zurich. Some of you might recognize the reference to Martin Kippenberger. Created in collaboration with Greg Ulmer, School Shootings the Memorial is a lasting monument to the victim of school shootings. Simply download and launch the mobile augmented reality browser and aim the device's camera at the open space just west of the U.S. Capitol building on the National Mall, of course, our national public square. After the 2007 shootings at Virginia Tech, you may remember the commentary that was published in the New Yorker about the heartbreaking experience of the police carrying the bodies out of the classrooms while the cell phones of the victims in the victims' pockets and backpacks kept ringing. This is a corresponding exhibition at the Cochran Gallery of Art last fall. As Greg Ulmer points out in his book, Electronic Monuments, monuments are an expression and acknowledgement of sacrifice on behalf of shared values. Accordingly, all monuments beg the question, what is the sacrifice and what are the shared values? Who is the hero? Who is the victim? Thank you.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you for coming out to join us on what I understand is one of the most beautiful spring days St. Louis has had in quite a while. I also want to thank Harriet and Craig for the invitation to respond to these extraordinary papers, and also the conveners of this conference. It's been a marvelous experience for all of us. As the respondent, I have been asked to comment on these wonderful papers and to provide an historical overview. I am happy to do both, and I want to begin by noting that the panel's strength and relevancy is that it offered three different perspectives, one by an academic, another by an arts administrator, and a third by a practicing artist. Tacit acknowledgement that by definition, public art is not the sole preserve of the Academy. To arrive at new meanings, many voices need to be heard. Harriet and I hold up the academic contingent and have been colleagues for many years at the City University of New York. Over time, we have talked through many public art issues, but none have been as compelling for me as those raised in her paper. That civic tragedies, instead of the inconclusive wars we have fought, are the focus of new forms of commemoration. That victims have become our heroes. Charlotte Cohen, a public administrator, takes the premise of Harriet's paper and widens its scope to include a new view, literally, of the Columbus statue in New York. Here, the artist Tatsu Nishi reconceptualized a familiar part of the city's skyline. In his piece, Discovering Columbus, Nishi visually reduced the scale of the Columbus statue by making it appear as an oversized tabletop ornament. As Cohen notes, he made no reference to the contentious revisionist history by which Columbus is known today, nor did he take into account the views of Italian Americans who view Columbus as their iconic hero. It is fascinating for me to consider how a 100-year-old landmark could fall into such postmodern ambiguity. Is Columbus now more victim than hero? Craig Freeman is a contemporary artist who employs new media in his public art practice. In his talk, he illustrated a range of projects that create what he calls virtual or augmented public spaces. These projects, most of them temporary, are later shared and maintained through the magic of film, video, and the internet. Importantly, he ends his presentation with questions, ones that I think are pertinent to the dilemma faced by all of us in this non-heroic age. Monuments, as he states, are an expression and acknowledgement of sacrifice on behalf of shared values. For him, what we need to consider is, what is the sacrifice and what are the shared values? With these questions in mind, where do I go? No, sorry. With these questions in mind, I want to share a few slides of 3 historic monuments. 2 are monuments to heroes, while another is dedicated to what I would term ambiguous victims, because I think ambiguity, what is the sacrifice and what are the shared values, is the real subject of today's panel, and perhaps of this conference itself. One of the most admired Gilded Age monuments is Augustus St. Gaudens's equestrian gilded bronze statue of the Union hero, General William Tecumseh Sherman, near the southeast corner of New York Central Park, a pendant, ironically, of the Columbus column at the other end of the park. Not quite a town square, but contained within the city's gridlocked neighborhoods, its location, and this I'm referring to the Sherman, in front of the fabled Plaza Hotel, could pass for one. In comparison, I'm showing another example of an equestrian monument dedicated to the memory of the Confederate hero, Robert E. Lee. The sculpture by the 19th century French academic artist Antonin Mercier is also cited at a city's focal point through its placement at the head of Monument Avenue in Richmond, Virginia. Placed high on granite podiums, both generals sit erect in their saddles. They are stirring images that lack only the clarion call of the bugle. 100 years ago, these sculptures were the pride of their communities and continue to be so today. Yet the Lee immediately raises questions. Why is this losing general of the Civil War still honored in Virginia? Is it in reality a monument to a victim? It's hard to know. But let me put this question in the context of a monument that we saw yesterday on the tour of Forest Park. George Zolney's Confederate Memorial. Done 25 years after the Lee and 50 years after the end of the Civil War, Missouri's Confederate Memorial, unlike Virginia's, is not a heroic sculpture. Funded and promoted by the United Daughters of the Confederacy, St. Louis's memorial is just one of hundreds of outdoor sculptures installed across the South, reflecting the ethos of what has come to be called the lost cause. These monuments, as do the ones discussed by Harriet, certainly challenge the, quote, myth of national identity, unquote. And as memorials to the lost cause, they can also be considered in the way that she discussed as therapeutic monuments. Missouri was a border state, which meant that it, along with 3 other states, Kentucky, Delaware, and Maryland, was a slave state that did not secede from the Union. The border status was extraordinarily by a recent exhibition at the Missouri Historical Society, which I had the privilege of seeing, which brought home how violent life was in the state, with neighbors fighting neighbors and families split by competing loyalties. After Reconstruction, many throughout the South, including Confederate Missourians, adopted what has come to be known as the lost cause, believing themselves to be victims of federal tyranny, states' rights advocates versus those dedicated to the preservation of the Union, with no mention of the ugly issue of slavery. It was Southern women who promoted the lost cause through the formation of memorial associations that raised funds in support for monuments to a vanished way of life. With regard to these efforts, I was struck by another of Harriet's comments. There is no question that the killing at Columbine can be understood as an attack on the institution of a way of life, much as the bombings of Oklahoma City. So too was the North's victory seen as a challenge to Southern customs and culture. And this monument by Zolney, specifically the bronze insert, illustrates the notion of the grieving mother who transmits the story of the war to the next generation, training her sons to fight the next battle for Southern honor. It is my contention that this practice of commissioning memorials for the lost cause is not unlike the practice of honoring victims. Yet it is the South's survivors who, as victims, honor a vanished way of life. And like today's memorials to victims, Confederate memorials occupy a contingent realm in this post-civil rights era. I said earlier that both of the equestrian statues were the prides of their communities. Well, I think that is true in Richmond. I'm not so sure about New York. We see it more as a landmark and tourist destination than an object of pride, probably not dissimilar to the way we regard the Columbus Monument. Charlotte successfully ties together the countervailing views that surround this memorial. What I liked in particular was that she showed all sides of the Columbus problem, if I may call it that. Her observations and strategies, and those suggested by Craig, help us imagine provocative interventions that may help us to see or reinterpret the General Sherman Monument. Yet, I am not sure the Southern monuments, the General Lee and the Confederate Memorial, could be satisfactorily reimagined. Like the monuments discussed by Harriet, the Vietnam Memorial, and the Memorial to Victims in Oklahoma City, Littleton, Colorado, and New York, these Confederate monuments do not so much illuminate as, in her words, quote, camouflage history. Thank you very much.
So we'll go to questions now. How much time do we have for questions?
We started a little late, so let's do 15 minutes.
So 15 minutes of questions and answers. Yeah. Could you use the mic, please?
Thanks. Hello?
Yeah.
Hi, my name's Jim Desicino. I'm a sculptor, particularly focused on monuments. So I'm always asking this question, since we deal so much with mass culture and repetition and pattern in monuments since the Vietnam Veterans Memorial, how do we now kind of focus our attentions onto something that's more like the equestrian statues that could become focused rather than expanding exponentially forever in making contemporary monuments? How do we come back and make like a synthesis of an idea in making monuments today?
Are these mics on? No.
Yeah.
Yes?
Yeah.
Great. Well, I think back to my examples, something like what Nora Magnuson is doing and trying to grow a project like that that does reference historical markers so specifically, yet in a very contemporary mode. And the ghost bikes as well.
The one thing I'd say is that maybe I would reverse the question a little bit and say, why would we want to do that? I think that this time demands the diffusion and the distribution of these kinds of sentiments, right? So that the idea of focusing is falling away to the notion of diffusion and distribution. So does that make sense?
Seeing that for 30 years.
Yeah.
So I was wondering if maybe a change is necessary.
Let me just complicate your question a bit, which is that monuments, in the traditional sense, also retain their meaning, or perhaps only retain their meaning, by the kinds of events that take place around them. So if they're not re-acknowledged over time, in a way, we don't even know that they're there. You know, we all pass these invisible, they become part of the, urban wallpaper, if you will. So I'm thinking of the example of the Columbus, but I'm also thinking in a more positive light of a very well documented use of the Lincoln Memorial, which was actually built not to, to bring the country back together again, but if you think of the different historic events that have taken place there, more recently, Barack Obama's presence at that memorial at a really important time. I think we can't just think about the statues, the memorials, the monuments in and of themselves, but think in terms of further use. So before we throw out the concept of a single structure, maybe we could expand the way we consider it.
Hello. I just one quick comment. I thought it was interesting, Professor Webster using the Sherman statue, since it was not very well appreciated by Southerners and not accepted by Southerners, and the famous expression about it, just like a Yankee to make a lady walk, is kind of famous statement about that statue. But my question is for Charlotte. Very quick one. Just curious, what was on the television in the Discovering Columbus exhibition? What was showing on it?
What I remember, and if anyone else saw it, they might remember differently, was CNN.
Yeah, it was CNN.
It was CNN.
So,
Ongoing.
24/7.
There's somebody here.
I'm Irv. I'm a sculptor and professor. I don't want to sound cold-hearted here, but I'm wondering if the prototype that you suggested that was basically done by Maya Lin with the wall and the names has kind of paralyzed memorial design. It spawned a lot of copycat projects that now I find that idea of the names becoming kind of a gimmick that further camouflages the history, as you suggest, Harriet. I'm just wondering what the panel thinks about that.
I would totally agree with that. It's become a paradigm we've not been able to shift from. And I think we are waiting, what is the next paradigm? I mean, maybe it may lie in the kind of work that Craig is doing. It may rely somewhat in the widespread practice of artists sort of taking on traditional memorials and questioning their values. But I totally agree with you. You cannot, we have not been able as a society to move beyond that. Oh, completely. Excuse me. I mean, yeah.
Right.
Oh, right. No, the comment was even the 9/11 memorial doesn't, move us far away from the Vietnam Veterans Memorial because, in fact, Maya Lin was on the jury and, was a champion of this design. I'm not saying she controlled the jury.
And I think this addresses your the very first question about this repetition, this idea of continuation of prototypes, right?
This question is mainly back to Harriet and your proposal that seemed to indicate that you wanted or you hoped for memorials toward victims to be more temporary, and did I understand you correctly that you were hoping for those memorials to actually become platforms for artists to expand the forms of memorialization and monumentation?
Well, you took my thoughts a little bit further than I did. But yes, in answer to your question, and thanks for doing that. I don't see that commissioning memorials by victims' families is a very positive practice for anybody. We've all lost loved ones, and we all commemorate those losses in our own way, but would we do that? Why should we, as a group, then maybe we as a group would be not a bad group, but in general, then be charged with designing a national memorial that has to last into time in those times, in those moments, in those months when we're most passionately grieving our individual lost ones, because our lives will never be the same, right? So I guess I'm suggesting two things. One is immediate memorials are really important, and there's sort of there's another category in there, like temporary immediate memorials, like the Tribute in Light, which was so successful in New York and was the work of artists. But I am suggesting that these immediate needs, that's something that the people who've lost their loved ones could really focus their attentions on, because those will address what they need at that moment. And I'm suggesting that commissioning memorials, not without representation of a larger public, be the purview of those people who are best able to realize larger expressions. And that would be you guys in the room. So yes, thank you for pushing me to that next step in terms of who should design them. I believe that the most compelling memorials that we have were designed by artists and architects, often working together. The Lincoln Memorial being one example.
But Harriet, that raises a question of the money. In other words, I think a lot of the money that comes for the commissioning of these memorials comes out of that emotional groundswell that is more immediate. Are you still going to be able to galvanize people to contribute to something 5, 10 years later?
I'm not saying we shouldn't start thinking. That's a really good question. Of course, everything boils down to the money if we want to be able to do it. I'm not suggesting that we necessarily put it off, starting work on the permanent Bill Memorial, but more in a sense of having that be a separate group with representations from the local community. Those things could start simultaneously, and I think we could support them that way. But I think you're absolutely right. If we wait 5 or 10 years, we're going to be in a financial bind.
Yeah, it's the rush to commemorate
Rush
in
to
such
mourning.
a permanent way that is just proliferating so much. So it's this process, right? It's about process.
It's about process, exactly.
As a kind of an extension of that question about immediate memorials, I was really struck by having the ghost bikes as part of the presentation. As a cyclist, I've really reacted very poorly to ghost bikes because it's a continual reminder of my potential victimhood, and that's like an incredibly frightening thing to experience when you're actually riding down a road with large vehicles. And so it's something that I've wondered is there a better way for us to have that immediate memorial in that specific context, but not perpetuate our own victimhood, which is what I've struggled with that particular form. And I think there's other memorials that certainly fill that, where we're saying, let's have an immediate response, but also let's move forward and say, you know, riding a bicycle is actually not dangerous in these ways. Let's not continually remember that.
I agree as a bike rider. You know, to see the roadside memorials, Harriet showed some images of those. It's an outgrowth of that kind of expression with the ghost bikes. But the ghost bikes are also this activist movement, as I said. So, and I think that's been very effective in cities like where I live in New York. There's been major change in terms of bike lanes and medians and speed limit reduction, you know, incredible changes in urban design and urban development in response to just this growing kind of activity and movement by people.
Hi, my name is Dan McGuire. I'm a former park director here in the city of St. Louis. And it seems you've not addressed another group of victims, which is problematic and I think growing. It's people that have, the families that want to honor groups of, say, SIDS victims or cancer victims that have stood the test of time, that have a whole lot of money, that come in and say, I want this place in a public space to honor my loved ones. If you'd want to chat about that, I assume it's still a problem. It was a problem 5 to 10 years ago.
It's like the Mellon Park problem. Are these, they want to do it on public space? Is that part of their?
Yeah. And oftentimes they come in, this is a great place right here. This is where I want to live.
Well,
And I've got the money, what's wrong, and they're crying and they're weeping, and it's difficult.
So how do you feel about it?
Charlotte.
No, but how do you feel about it?
How do I feel about
As a former Parks Administrator?
It was difficult. Many of us, particularly this city too, does not have a public art policy. What do you do with these things? I mean, it cries out that we should have a policy to guide these people. I personally, with the vacant ground we have in the city, would like to see, you know, we've got millions of vacant slots. Let's talk to the city. Let's create something new, not in the middle of an existing public space. Create a new one that you want to do and endow to make sure it's taken care of. That's what I would think is a solution.
Okay, good.
Yeah, I mean, that makes a lot of sense, something that could be dedicated to this group of issues.
it does go back to money, doesn't it? You know, who has the resources? Annie Seaman's family had the resources, right? So they were able to make a memorial to her and not about an issue. But these kind of issue-oriented projects also, you know, it is a lot about patronage and the ability to navigate a complex, bureaucratic city system and be successful. And some people are very successful, as we know.
Right, exactly.
That's right.
Is that what this is really for? I mean, that's a cemetery.
Yeah,
That's right.
exactly.
That's right, that's right.
Kind of an unexpectedly related question for John. Is the digital divide a concern for your work in terms of access and equity with augmented reality and public art?
Yeah, you know, that question came up over dinner meals sometime during the weekend or something, and you know, the first thing you have to ask if in fact art hasn't always been an elitist practice, and you know that the fact of the matter is that the cell phones are proliferating at a rate that's so vast that you know, as an artist, I can't imagine a wider scope audience than you know, compared to people who might go into a museum. Now, public art's a little different because it's meant to be out in public space and that sort of thing. But of course, it's a divide, and you know, but that's not reason not to kind of engage in it somehow.
Yeah, let me just add to that, that's a divide that's shrinking even as we speak. I teach at City College, which is a public university. I don't think I have a single student, undergraduate student, without a cell phone, and I don't expect that to change anytime soon. So, you know, kids now are growing up with cell phones. You see really almost babies holding them. There's preschools in New York that give them to their students. You know, we're going to be the techno dinosaurs before this is over.
And in memorial practices, like many cultural practices, are just going to have to respond to that change in the kind of psyche of people, you know, the kids growing up with this kind of technology or something. It'll happen naturally. And they'll kind of, you know, I think at some point the whole discussion about money in parks and, you know, policies and so forth, they're just going to get eclipsed by like a crowdsourcing response. It doesn't cost money, you know. It doesn't cost me anything to put an augmented reality in this room if I want to do it. I don't have to get permission. You know, that's my response. But the kids growing up with this technology, this will seem an antiquated practice to them, I would suspect, at some point. You know, idea that you'd have to, you know, make institutions and raise money to put, you know, a gesture out in this public space.
There's a question.
Yes, sir.
And this relates to what you're talking about right now, John, about augmented reality. Your presentation put me in mind of the movies The Conflation and Blow Up and so on, and the idea of, I guess, the historian Hayden White, who was such a relativist that he believed things, or he wrote that history was really in the mind of the viewer. It's all points of view, as if there was no evidence. My question is really about, with this augmented reality, it creates an individual sense of the environment and restitution of what should be memorialized, perhaps. But what about the public space? How different is it to have it be a single person's point of view creating this virtual reality, and to have physical objects creating a reality that we all dwell in and can see simultaneously? So I'm trying to get at that level of something that exists in your mind and for you only, that is for your pleasure and interest, and something that is really part of a public dimension, physical.
Well, I'm not sure I'm completely understanding the question, but the idea that, you know, I guess the point I'm trying to make is that this virtual reality is no longer other. You know, it is part of we experience this virtual space every time you can't get a cell phone signal and you walk out of the building and that sort of thing. It's a reality that we're already deeply immersed in, and there isn't this kind of strict separation. As far as I've always looked for opportunities for artists to express in themselves individually, not just myself, but any artist. It's kind of central to this question, because much of what gets done in the public sphere requires so much, public debate and infrastructure and permits and everybody's take on things, that it's difficult that, the idea that an artwork would end up being the original vision of the artist by the time it's all said and done is quite remote. And the idea that there's always windows of opportunities emerge as technology emerges to kind of go in and intervene before the corporations take over augmented reality, which will actually be the case quite soon, where your virtual world will just be kind of completely littered with targeted advertising and so forth. But there's this narrow window of opportunity for artists to come out and just be able to intervene and express themselves without all of the baggage of that. And I think that there's value in that. It doesn't always produce the most appropriate results, but I think that there's value in that.
And let me just complicate that a little further in terms of a more unified experience. We haven't really raised this issue, but I think taken, the most agreed upon successful memorial, although we're looking to move past it, the Vietnam Veterans Memorial, what happens there is not collective memory, it's collected memory. And that's a concept that James Young and somebody before him, whose name I think Paul Connerton, first put out there. And I think it's really, really important. We talk about collective memory as if it exists, and I would challenge that notion completely. I think we talk about memory that's collected at a site in the same way that memory could collect at the kinds of virtual sites that you address. I'm not seeing a huge divide.
I guess what I was thinking of is what I love about what you're doing is it has this very subversive element to it, and yet I guess my question is coming from the fact that it seems so ephemeral and so invisible to many others. And so I was wondering if there was a way to make it more shared. I guess that's where that was coming from.
I don't want to dominate here. If other people have answers, but I should just say quickly is that nothing exists these days, not even public art, but nothing exists these days unless it has an existence, a presence on the internet, right? And so the work that I'm doing isn't meant to be accessed the way that the bronze horse, equestrian statue in the park is meant to be walked to or something like that. It requires a social networking to get the word out that there's this thing in Tiananmen Square, and that you need to go down there with your phone to be able to see it, right? So that there's a whole kind of social networking working fabric that is meant to be engaged, and it's just as much the case with any traditional form of monumentality as it is with virtual forms of monumentality. And there's also the part of once all of the world's digital data is uploaded to Google's supercell cloud or something like that, eventually all of our digital data will be floating around somewhere in the internet, and so the archaeologists of the future will find that object and reconstruct it with emulators or something, so I don't think it's so ephemeral as it seems.